Testing, testing, that works. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. Well, good afternoon and welcome to Bruegel, a joint Bruegel and University College event. The topic for today is UK-EU energy and climate cooperation. We think now is the moment, as many others, for pushing this item further up the agenda, both in Brussels and London, and that's what we hope to do today, having a discussion broadly on what priority topics are in this space, and then a bit of a discussion on how we might move the conversation further forward. I'm very happy to welcome initially Professor Michael Grubb from University College London. University College London is working on a project on exactly this topic, and as such is a co-host of the event today. Michael is, I think most of you know, he's formerly from the UK Climate Change Committee, and I think he's offered lots of policy advice both to the UK government and the EU government, and is well placed for comments today. So I would hand over to Michael for some opening thoughts on the topic. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. So huge thanks also to yourself, to Georg, Bruegel, etc. for hosting this meeting. I should also remember to thank INET, the Institute of New Economic Thinking, which has given us some grants over the last few years, partly to pursue thinking around the dynamics of transition in energy systems. And they also have contributed to the project that has helped to bring us here today, including my colleague Jaroslav Melek. I'd like to thank also, who's been busily working on some of the detailed issues arise. And also we've got a follow-on short session. We'll be looking at some of the technical aspects. But I think my role really was to just try and explain a bit why we want to pursue this, why we're glad to work with Bruegel, why we think now's the time. In a nutshell, I think we have a limited window of time to design and deliver the next phase of energy transition that is both economically and politically successful. Let me unpick those words briefly. By we, yes, I mean the UK and the EU. Putting aside, thoughts and wishes about what happened or what could or not or should not have happened, we're in that reality. We know we have a new government in the UK that's made overtures about a reset. The EU, I think, if you'll excuse my mobile phone going off an ideal moment, I was in a couple of meetings, partly during the course of this project, where the reaction we actually had from Brussels trip, European Parliament representative was, well, it's kind of on the UK to come forward with proposals because you guys left, and if you want closer cooperation, we've got other priorities like war in the East and lots of other things. So come up with initiatives and proposals that look attractive. On the other hand, banging on the door and saying, could you let us a bit back in just a little bit for the bits that benefit us most is probably not the best strategy in itself. But I have heard more about actually, if we're going to succeed in this transition, it really is a two-way street that, Northern Europe, Northwest Europe obviously depends upon clean energy resources in the North Sea and efficient access to those. But yeah, so the we is both UK and EU. Where are the mutual benefits? Where is the real opportunities and incentives to go forward? So that implies, yes, I think growing physical interdependence in the energy system. I also sense, for discussion, a growing political independence, particularly in the light of the US elections. And I think it's already appearing very clearly in the media, some of the higher media. The FT had a great article on the pressures that the UK will be under to jump one way or another in terms of Atlantic or the EU. And I'm not convinced it's in either the UK's or the EU's interest to try and jump halfway across the Atlantic with the Trump administration, but there will be some pretty intense pressures around the nature of the relationships. So that was the we. Why a time window? Well, I think for delivery, to a degree, we've got maybe a 4 or 5 year time window. In the UK, as you know, we have had our own elections, which resulted in a huge majority for the new government. So we've kind of got a window of 4 to 5 years of a government that is really keen to reset relations and slightly more, technocratic, but I think thoughtful, analytic government interested in the value of the European relationship. And to some extent, we have, the European Commission set for a few years in its current structure, obviously varying political pressures in some of the member states. But hopefully, at least in terms of some of the formal political institutions, we've got a window of a few years to deliver. But in terms of design, it is rapidly shooting up the UK agenda. We have this thing called TCA, and it's due to expire with a sort of rather rapid approach. And the default is it will probably roll on conditions which are not particularly beneficial, certainly for the UK trading relationships, but I think more widely for the UK and EU relationships. In the most extreme case, I have heard a very senior representative of National Grid say, do you know what? All this stuff about North Sea resources and potential and hybrid assets and efficient use, none of that's going to happen unless we sort out the trading arrangements. It's really not. Because you might think on paper it looks like good for both sides, but the investment uncertainties are so huge. If we don't know what the arrangements would be for selling electricity efficiently across the UK and Europe once these things are built, we ain't going to build them. And it was a pretty blunt message. Of course, resolving that is not easy. So that was really, the motivation for this. As I say, I think slightly turbocharged by the challenges to the UK and Europe on, okay, you talk a lot of big talk about climate and decarbonisation. Actually, yeah, you've made some good progress over the last decade, but the next phase is going to be different and arguably tougher. Can you do it? And I think that is the question we'd like to look at from a UK-EU perspective. And I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Very nice way to kick the session off. We would now move to a panel discussion on these issues and more. I'm pleased to welcome 3 guests who've joined us today. We are joined by Hazel Gulliver, a director at Scottish Power, which is part of the Iberdrola group. Hazel used to live in Brussels for 10 years, hasn't been back for a while, and is happy to be back, she informs me. We're joined by Adam Berman, who is of the Energy UK, director of the Energy UK, which is a trade association for energy companies in the UK, very broad-reaching, Scottish Power, one of them. Upstream oil and gas are out, but everybody else pretty much is in, I think. So he's very well placed to give a UK perspective. And finally, but not least, we're joined by Professor Carsten Neuhoff of the Technical University Berlin, also head of Climate Policy Department at DIW Berlin. And he has done, as I've seen, a PhD in the University of Cambridge, and hence brings some European flavour, but slightly tainted by 3 years in Cambridge, I believe. So I'll kick off with Hazel, and I'll give each of the panelists sort of an opening few minutes, largely to see what are the key issues they see in this space. As Michael has pointed out, I think there'll be some agreement. Hazel, from your perspective, from Scottish Power, from Iberdrola, how have the last years been? What have the big issues been, and what are you hoping for moving forward?
Okay, so full disclosure. I'm a European lawyer. I lived in Brussels for 10 years, and I've only ever worked in European affairs my entire career, so that's obviously the place where I'm coming from. And now I work for a Spanish energy company. So there is a flavour of where I'm coming from and what I'm saying. So, and as Ben said, like I've lived here for a long time, but I haven't actually been in Brussels for 5 years. And this is the first time I've been asked to speak on anything about EU and UK energy cooperation in a very long time. So that in itself is a note of optimism for me. The fact we are here and we're having this conversation, is something that wouldn't have happened a few years ago. So that's the first thing. But so Scottish Power and Iberdrola. So I'm here to give a business perspective. But I can also give you a perspective from, so 14 years ago, when I worked for Ofgem, I was around when the North Seas Countries Offshore Grid Initiative, Niscogee, Memorandum of Understanding was signed. Some of you in the room might remember that. And working for Ofgem and with the UK government on how we develop that, or how we maximise the potential of the resource in the North Seas. I think that's the phrase that we're still saying today in the NSEC world. Back then, we had different groups working on regulation, market arrangements, trading arrangements, all that stuff. And 14 years later, I was delighted to see Ofgem publish at the beginning of November a decision allowing for a pilot regime for offshore hybrid assets in the North Seas, something we had been suggesting since 2010. It's not just the electricity trading arrangements, and the trading arrangements, that's huge. It's the regulatory arrangements on either side as well, and how you match those up. And at the point working for Ofgem and speaking to the colleagues on the other side of the channel, it was just never going to happen. And we came very quickly to the conclusion that we need to rip up the rule book and start again. So then I went into Scottish Power Iberdrola, and from a business perspective, Niscogee was still going on, and they were looking for pilot projects and how even speaking to the UK government, again, a pilot project off the ground in the North Seas. It's like, yeah, but to do that, you're going to have to rip up the rule book and start again. And I think the fact that we now seem to be moving towards a place where we're at least thinking about ripping up the rule book, it was UK very much set in their ways, other European countries very much set in their ways. And now we're coming to a place where we're saying that, yes, if we can do something a bit different, we might move things forwards. We can't do it in the way that we've always done things in the past. And Brexit has had virtually no impact on that. As I said, it was 2010 since we've been having these conversations, and the North Seas Energy Cooperation is still a non-binding group of countries with the UK joining in to have conversations. I don't know how that's going to move things forward without some kind of binding commitment to a new set of rules which will move the dial. So from an investment perspective, just very briefly, anything that creates any kind of uncertainty, it's not going to happen. It's hard enough. Conditions are difficult enough in terms of investment. We're investing a lot in the North Seas. We've got a number of offshore wind projects, and we're fully behind the development of those. But asking any private developer to add any kind of additional risk onto their project in order to develop an offshore hybrid asset is at the moment is not going to fly. So anything that can make things smoother, so the trading arrangements, regulatory arrangements that are aligned, and sort of this spirit of collaboration rather than kind of sort of working against each other. We are interconnected, it's a fact. It's become more and more important and more obvious in recent years why that's a good thing on both sides. So working together, it just feels like a no-brainer. So I don't want to say it. I mean, obviously I have my full disclosure at the outset. Why would you not cooperate? I'm waiting for someone to tell me why not, other than politics.
I think we can get onto the politics toward the end, which will be juicy. Maybe a couple of pieces on housekeeping on my part. First, I forgot to welcome the online audience and welcome questions from Slido. In the room, you're of course welcome to raise your hand, but if you prefer anonymous and hard questions on Slido with the hashtag cooperation, particularly for online. And maybe two more points on acronyms. Michael mentions TCA, which probably most know, but in case not, the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which sets out the trading arrangements for the UK and the EU post-Brexit. And Hazel mentioned NSEC, which you probably will hear again, North Seas Energy Cooperation, which is the group who sits together of, I think, about 12 North Sea countries, including the UK in some status, and works on all issues there. So I'd move to Adam. I already introduced you as a representative of UK energy companies. What are they saying? What are they complaining about? What would they like to have from UK-EU cooperation moving forward in this space?
Yeah, of course. Well, firstly, I might start off with an apology. And actually a particular apology to the UK officials in the room, because this is on your behalf. We are not very good at talking to or about Brussels in the UK. That hasn't changed with the new government, but there has been a lot of positive noises about the importance of the relationship with the EU and the need to revisit it, the need to strengthen it, the need for more cooperation. That's fantastic, but there are still lots of missteps that this government is making. give it a bit of time. They are figuring things out. We are after years of some really, really damaging politics in the UK, trying to figure out how to move forward in a constructive way. I think in terms of why we should do this, there's lots of reasons why we should cooperate. We may have left the EU. We cannot get away from the fact that we are deeply interconnected to the EU and to Europe more broadly in terms of energy and climate, in terms of the pipes and wires that run under the North Sea, Irish Sea, etc., that ensure security of supply on both sides. I think it's striking the facts that have come out, after the energy crisis, for example, that in 2022, about a quarter of the EU's lost capacity of gas from Russia came from the UK that actually filled the gap. There are lots of people walking around Paris and Lille today who don't realise that for months on end, their security of supply, their lights stayed on because the UK kept generating electricity when half the French nuclear fleet was offline. There are lots of fantastic examples of security of supply, and they go both ways. I think the reality is that actually not just that we are interconnected today, it is that we are going to become much more interconnected in the future. And I think to Michael's point about the energy transition, when you look at any feasible scenario of what our energy system is going to look like in 10 or 20 years, it is one which is much more interconnected. And so just to give you a really simple example, wind tends to go from west to east, right? So on an average blustery day in December in Europe, the Irish will wake up with wind. Then by the middle of the morning, it will have reached the UK. Then we're moving on to Germany, Denmark, onto Norway. You want all European consumers to benefit at all times from that wind. At the moment, they don't. They can't. The trading arrangements aren't there. It's just not efficient enough. And particularly when we're looking at the North Sea and the incredible potential of the North Sea for these really complicated hybrid assets where you've got lots of different lines heading in different directions from a wind farm, say, you maybe have clean hydrogen created there. You can't have someone sitting at a terminal saying, I'm going to dispatch electricity to this place, I'm going to dispatch it to this place. It all has to be completely automated and highly efficient. That is the only way, as Hazel said, of making those economies of scale and making those investments stack up. I think all of Northern Europe is accelerating, roughly the same pace. Its transition to clean, homegrown energy, largely driven by renewables. Certainly we've done analysis that looks at a declaration that came out of North Seas Energy Corporation, out of NSEC, the Ostend declaration, which came out, was either last year or the year before, I think it was last year, where they said that by 2050 they want to have got 300 gigawatts of wind. Most of that, actually the majority of that, comes from the UK, but heightened cooperation saves us about 13 billion euros. That saves consumers all around Europe 13 billion euros on their energy bills. There are quite a lot of roadblocks in the way. I mean, at the moment, the Trading Cooperation Agreement, the TCA, is not really written in a way that is consistent with how the energy system is developing and what it's going to look like in 10 or 20 years. I think in any world, the Trading Cooperation Agreement would likely have to evolve over time. But you look at some of those roadblocks. So, take the incoming carbon border adjustment mechanism, for example, on the EU side, the CBAM kicks in properly from 1st of January 2026. Because we are now a third country, and I completely recognise, as we would say in the UK, we don't live rent-free in anyone's mind. DG Taxud didn't, perhaps spend as long as they could have done thinking about what happens to electricity. And now we've got a structure in which electricity is going to face clean electricity from the UK, from wind and solar and nuclear, is going to pay a carbon price on arrival in the EU. What does that mean? It means higher emissions in Northern European countries. It means higher energy bills in Northern European countries. That's not of use to anyone. It's not of use to the UK because we want to be able to invest in clean energy infrastructure in the UK that we can use to export energy to Europe. It is not of use to Northern Europe either. We look at the emissions trading systems on both sides that remain disconnected. Absolutely, it's something the UK government will need to move on, but it is clearly a problem. And with the EU CBAM kicking in for a bunch of sectors, not just electricity, but across kind of steel and beyond, there are really critical issues related to competitiveness. And then finally, on electricity trading, maybe I'll just say a few words. We ended up within the TCA. We were pushed for time. I think people in the room who may have been involved in it were pushed for time. We came up with a solution that was probably unworkable, but we had to come up with something. I think it's probably the moment now to recognise that we should think about a different form of trading that might actually work on both sides. One that is still compatible with the kind of broader legal structure of the TCA. I think there is something in that realm in relation to what's called price coupling that may well work. But, when I go and talk to UK policymakers, because most of my job is aimed at London rather than aimed at Brussels, and I was in number 10 Downing Street just a couple of weeks ago talking about exactly these issues. I can say to UK policymakers, in energy and climate alone, not any other sector, just energy, there is a £10 billion drag on the UK economy if you don't cooperate more with the EU over the next parliament, so over the next 5 years. That number actually goes up over time. Every new parliament, every new 5-year cycle, that number will go up billions and billions and billions. Now that, unfortunately, over time doesn't just become a UK problem, it also becomes a Northern European problem as well. And so I really hope that, kind of as Hazel said, the politics is the only reason that holds this back. But I do hope that we're all able to look at this, that the UK government moves forward quickly with productive and constructive suggestions, but that ultimately we recognise that the only way of reaching climate neutrality together at lowest cost and at the fastest route possible is through a bit more cooperation and hopefully some livelier and more open discussion over the coming years.
Thanks, Adam. Points all very well taken and shared, pretty much. Especially the CBAM electricity point is a pet peeve of mine that I struggle to get my head around. Carsten, again, yourself, you have a European perspective shared with this University of Cambridge. Do you agree with Adam and Hazel's major points, and what for you are the key issues for UK and EU to work on in the coming years?
I was in Britain for 10 years even, until 2009. In a way, just to kind of be honest, in a way you were as well. And so I'm really happy to follow on the two of you, because 15 years back on a table like this, most of the points you would have made from an industry perspective was our job at the academic side to outline the vision that could be the perspective. And now our job seems to be more to think, okay, how can we achieve what you have been putting on the table, and perhaps take the liberty as an academic to stay tangible options that may be more difficult to agree as an industry body at the moment, but hopefully addressing precisely the points you have. So I think there's huge potential in North Sea wind and the interconnections, partially because we get cheaper and cheaper solar in the south and in the summer, but in the winter time in Northern Europe, we need the wind. And we need the interconnection to kind of balance our systems as effectively as possible. So that's huge potential to come forward too. And I think we have really now an opportunity to improve this cooperation. Obviously, cooperation requires usually adjustments on both sides. And there will be huge adjustments in Europe, in the European Union, if we look at terms of what is needed for the energy market right now. And I think this then makes things easier to come together, because you can look something that works together rather than having to make an adjustment just for Britain, as you outlined earlier at the beginning. I think that's more difficult politically. So part one is, even Germany recognizes now that we can't live along with a single pricing zone. We need local pricing. I think that has been now this summer actually, an article with many of the advisors that previously argued we can't protect the single pricing zones, argued no, we have to kind of get to local pricing. And now there's various pathways to get to local pricing, but probably the quickest way is with something kind of sandbox type approaches. Having individual countries, and initially I thought more about Poland or Italy, to taking forward more local pricing domestically, showing how well it works such that we can find the best way and then replicate that across Europe, which has been our common practice in Europe so far in terms of trying out something and then moving forward. And obviously in this case, Britain is a candidate to follow this pathway, and there's a lot of momentum on moving forward on market design choices. And I hope we can really integrate these debates to learn stronger from each other. I felt certainly 15 years back there was a very strong link between Brussels and London in terms of exchanging, learning from each other, and I think taking this forward on this line. What failed last year on the market design reforms in Britain was thinking about nodal pricing without looking in terms of the risks where people perceive it could increase my costs in some part of the country. That badly backfired. And I think there's a very funny narrative that within our countries, we will have regions where it is far more attractive to have industrial production. we don't really know in Germany, for example, where these regions are. It could be in the south because there we might get a lot of solar and very cheap output. It could be in northwest because there's a lot of onshore wind. It could be in the north or east, wherever it is. And if you look at different models, they show you different outcomes. A really funny perspective because it tells everyone, I don't know where to go, but I know that my site might be at risk. What worse policy recommendation to give? So the opposite should be the case. We need a clear policy commitment to say we make affordable, reliable electricity prices across each of our countries, across all of Europe. And if we move to local prices, it is to allow effective and efficient operation of the systems. We don't need to relocate industrial production anywhere, and we don't know where to put it anyway, but to give that credibility and the certainty to all market participants. And that is possible because if we move to effective congestion management, we suddenly don't have large redispatch costs anymore. We pay 2 to 4 billion, that's 10 euro per megawatt hour, redispatch costs in Germany alone. And the borders to the neighboring countries, we get 1.6 billion revenue from congestion revenue between countries. Why don't we make congestion revenue within our countries by moving to local prices and use this congestion revenue to then guarantee stable price levels for all consumers in the country? And again, sandbox approach. Why not start offshore and to kind of look at local pricing, look at how to kind of do effective use of the congestion revenue to then stabilize the revenue for consumers and for the wind projects, because obviously they don't want to have uncertain revenues, otherwise they can't be financed. So that's the second part where Britain has been the front runner on on contracts for differences for wind development as a very effective way of funding and financing these parts. The European Directive for Energy Market Reform now says, yes, we have to move pretty much in this direction. We have to share the benefits with the consumers of the upsides. The cheapest way and the most experienced way is to do this. So let's do it together on the offshore side and directly link it to consumer benefits. Again, something where we can learn from each other, implement this in a joint manner, and implement it in a manner such that we can pool, such that there's joint tenders has been a long topic. But if we implement the joint tenders for offshore parks, then consumers on both sides of the lines can benefit to their share in terms of stable, reliable, and affordable electricity prices. The third part you pointed out, security of supply. I think we are up for more uncertainty now. We are still in a war. We still have a lot of uncertainty and risk for infrastructure and global supply chains. And in gas and in oil, we have strategic reserves. Why not think about something similar? We have a debate on capacity market to think about a reliability reserve on the power side, where every country has some backup capacity just for the emergency case, and make sure if prices get high, like 500 euros, that comes into the market. It protects the market. It can have volatility in the market up to 500 euros to make investments in flexibility viable. That's what we need to kind of get the electricity from wind and solar into the periods when there's little wind and solar. That's where we need flexibility, but that's where we don't need thousands of euros of prices. They just create risks and uncertainties for participants. And this kind of reliability reserve is something that we can share with each other. So in Britain, when we were over there, we were frustrated at the time when the Rough storage exploded, and didn't really work out at that time so well. So the European Security of Supply Directive is still work in progress. It has been kind of pitched together under emergency conditions 2 years back, but I think there's still quite a bit of reform necessary, and to do this in a joint approach would be really valuable going forward. Which leads me to the final point, CBAM. I think when at the European side it was implemented, it was, I feel as well, an add-on to the other CBAM parts. Nevertheless, it is clear if we have very different carbon pricing levels in countries, then interconnecting the power system is a bit tricky. And it creates, if you have a CBAM or not, quite fun distortions for the next 15 years as long as we have fossil assets in there. Now, I think what better opportunity to refine this CBAM than the cooperation between Britain and the European Union. Because if we succeed to jointly find a solution that works, then anyone other partner for the European Union will be very happy to implement the same mechanism because it's trusted that it is fair for both sides. All the other partners where we may apply the CBAM mechanism for electricity, they are a bit more dependent on the European Union, so it's a bit more difficult to kind of see whether that's a fair deal in terms of how we would evolve the CBAM for electricity. But I think the best outcome hopefully we'll reach is an integrated ETS. But nevertheless, as a backup for it, it would be quite nice to jointly improve the CBAM that is there for electricity, such that our power systems can seamlessly interact even if you have different carbon prices. And Britain now started the CBAM for the wider debate. I think we'll have a reform process for the CBAM on goods. I think a lot of debate there as well, but perhaps for a later session today.
Thanks, Carsten. Lots in there. I mean, in my scribbles, I have kind of 3, potentially 4 priority items that I think you 3 have raised for this debate, and I think they're items that have been shared in other publications. One is electricity trading and the North Sea and making sure we get this right. 2 is carbon pricing, CBAM, and ensuring that this kind of shared ideological belief in carbon pricing between the EU and the UK works for the benefit of both and not to the detriment. A 3rd is climate diplomacy, becoming all the more important with political events in the US. And again, the EU and the US, a shared position, shared pretty much development on many climate indicators and shared targets for where they want to get to. How do they work together to leverage that on the international stage? And a final one is the security of supply, which Carsten raised as an issue and Adam introduced. As a fellow British man, we like to point out how important the UK was during the energy crisis, which I think is also fair to do, to remind in Brussels just how important this trade was with the UK as something looking forwards. I would like to ask each of you on one of them to push a little bit further, and then depending on time we might be opening to the audience and on Slido. Perhaps Hazel, on electricity on the North Sea, you began by talking about this and the forms of collaboration. Adam introduced the Ostend Declaration targets, which I think are very ambitious. I think it's roughly a quadrupling by 2030. Might you add a little bit more flavor to just how serious the issue is? How serious are we? Are we progressing to reach those targets? Is it possible? And then particularly, what are you looking for? What are you asking? There's the TCA, which the energy chapter expires in 2026. This kind of certainty for business, is it a case of extending the TCA and kind of keeping dialogue there? Is it a case that we maybe have to rip the whole thing up and start again? Might you talk to those points and just expand a little bit more on this North Sea issue and how we move forwards there?
Yeah, sure. Are we progressing? I don't wish to be blunt, but not really. I mean, progress is being made, but as I mentioned before, 14 years to get to a point which we already knew 14 years ago isn't really very impressive progress. And I'm not saying that's the government or the regulator or industry's fault. It's just, why did it take so long to get to the point that we knew that we would have to do something different? There's resource there when we talk about security of supply, decarbonisation and efficient decarbonisation and electricity trading. It to me, like I said, it's just a no-brainer. The resources there. We have assets. So Iberdrola is developing a lot of offshore wind assets in the East Anglia region. We're fully committed to the CFD process, and it works. It's bringing the prices down and facilitating investment, and it works. And to talk about the pricing issue, I completely accept that the local pricing is on the table in the UK. The market reform conversations are ongoing. We're talking about zonal pricing. But from a developer's perspective, and we're not alone, and from a generator perspective, that anything that can disrupt the investment potential by introducing more uncertainty or increasing any time into the process is not a good thing. So it's about a trade-off between, okay, it might reform the pricing system, but it will take X number of years to get there, therefore investment will be delayed, therefore we won't meet our targets, therefore we'll potentially have security of supply crisis, whatever. So it's about, is now the time for that? Shouldn't we try and progress what we're doing? Like I started off by saying, it's not progressing at a speed that I really think it should be progressing in terms of the common sense approach. There's resource there. There's countries trading energy with each other. Why not? So don't introduce something else on top of that. It's similar in the EU as it is in the UK in the planning process. I'm not going to get into that on this conversation, but it's to get anything done just takes such a long time. So Ed Miliband was Energy Secretary when we started talking about this the last time. So and now he is again. So it's kind of a glib point, but it just emphasises how long these things are taking. So I think we do need to speed up. Whatever it is we're doing, we need to stop talking about it and just get on with it and speed things up. because, like I said, we've known for years what needs to happen. It just needs to happen, and the environment is ripe for it. And Carsten said something about it. It would be nice to cooperate and collaborate on such issues between the UK and the EU, and then CBAM, so the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism for people who might not be familiar with that. If we can cooperate with that between the UK and the EU, then others will see this is a good thing. But that's the point. It would be nice, but how do we get beyond that political? We don't want to give up this. We don't want to take that. We don't want to give you this, and we don't want to be seen to be allowing you to, what's the expression, is pick and choose, cherry picking from what kind of arrangements with the EU you like. So we need to get over all of that and start having a sensible conversation based on the facts of why it would be a good thing.
Thanks, Hazel. I think on this first point on electricity, it's clear it's stability that's needed. Adam, I would perhaps move to the CBAM and the ETS linkages question. There's also a question on Slido, which is along these lines by Anonymous. I can't introduce the person. This person is asking about whether CBAM and ETS is essential for solving electricity trading, which I would take in. But Mike, I would also phrase the question as what you see the potential here. I guess more from a UK perspective than an EU perspective. Is this something feasible that we can be talking about, relinking the ETSs? I think in the trade and cooperation agreement, I think there's some language to encourage this and to say that parties agree to working forwards in the next years. Can we place all our hopes on ETS linkage for solving the CBAM issue? Do we need to be realistic that's not feasible? Where would you stand on that?
So I think it is feasible. It does relate to electricity trading, but it's a slightly different problem. So maybe put it this way. A little question for the audience. Does anyone know which is the first country to establish an ETS system? Does anyone know that? 2002? It was the UK. Okay, Michael knew. That's cheating. You're the professor. Of course you're going to know. The UK was the first country to bring about a voluntary ETS in 2002. And the reason that they did it as an EU member state was that essentially the Commission asked them to. And the Commission said, if you think this is a viable solution, try it, and then we can talk about it in Brussels. And then from 2005 onwards, we had the EU ETS, which then kicked in, which the UK was part of until about 2020. So carbon pricing and emissions trading is something the UK's done for a generation, and I think they're quite proud of their history, and they've got good reasons to be proud of it. We ended up, post-Brexit, with an ETS, because of the political lines of that government, with an ETS that was essentially the EU ETS in all but name, but it had a Best of British badge on it, because we like to do that. We like to take ideas from Brussels and then say it's a British thing. But at least with electricity markets, you've done the same thing recently, which I enjoy as well. I'm glad that our electricity market reforms from a decade ago are now being adopted. What you end up with is two systems that are almost identical, even with some small divergences over the last few years. I mean, they're the two closest systems that have ever existed in the history of emissions trading. If those two systems can't link, well, certainly it presents real problems in terms of linkage and the growth of carbon pricing globally. And I think it probably also presents problems for the European Commission that have been keen to talk about global carbon pricing solutions. They've been keen to engage with countries like China with perhaps a sense that in the years to come, there may be more linkages internationally. If the UK, with its almost identical system, is unable to link with EUs, I think that does pose some big questions. I think there are lots of reasons why the UK could link its ETS with the EU's and vice versa. There are lots of reasons why they should. There's only one reason why the UK will, in my view, necessarily link there. They will have to link their ETS with the EU, and that's really has sort of nothing to do with this discussion. In a sense, it's not about energy and climate. It's about Northern Ireland, which is that the EU CBAM, in the eyes of the European Commission, applies in Northern Ireland. The EU CBAM, in the eyes of the UK government, does not. And for Northern Ireland, that poses some really big problems. It poses problems in terms of increased costs for consumers. It poses problems in terms of decreased availability of core components and goods for consumers, particularly goods that would have gone through what's called the green lane from Great Britain to Northern Ireland, which will now be moved into the red lane. It makes everything much more complicated, much more expensive. I would be shocked if the UK government, once this starts to happen, says, no, this is just the cost of doing business. We don't mind doing this. Because every conversation I have with senior people in the UK government, they say, we are a different government. We're not interested in divergence for the sake of divergence. And that would be all that this policy is. So for me, I'm really enthusiastic about it. I do think there's a moment here that we have to use, and primarily it's a moment just before the EU is set to kind of look at the EU ETS again in a really substantive way. It's also a moment where the UK is making big decisions about its ETS as well. There will be some difficult negotiations there. It's a trade negotiation. There are going to be trade-offs. The European Commission will start off with a hard line, and they'll say you need to align on absolutely everything. The UK will say no, we can't do that. I imagine that there is a reasonable position that can be found, not least because there's precedent. We have the Swiss EU linkage agreement, which was exactly the same thing. Now, yes, the political circumstances were different, but to those kind of ETS nerds in the room, there are things like the Swiss agreement doesn't include a market stability reserve, for example. The Swiss ETS doesn't have one. So, there are some people that say the UK, if it goes to the EU and wants a linkage agreement, the EU will say, well, what about your market stability reserve? You don't have one. Well, the Swiss don't have one either. So I think there are plenty of ways which you can draw on that precedent. That being said, I think the Commission has been fairly clear, and I understand their position. I think it's reasonable that the UK will have to come forward. It's taking some time, as I said at the beginning, it's taking some time for this government to figure out what it is they want, to figure out the lay of the land politically, how much the British people will care about these issues. I think there's still just I was in the British Parliament last night up until relatively late, and there's still this sense, there's just an unease about, what will the British people think? I think my challenge to policymakers is always, do the British people really care about the emissions trading system? I'd love it if they did, because it would mean people were interested in the same issues as I am. I think in practice, probably not. So I think the government will get there. It will just take a little bit of time.
That's interesting. Thanks. I was just about to challenge you on exactly that point, so you preempted it. And it draws parallels, I think, with the ETS2 in Brussels and this carbon tax, which is affecting people much more on transport and on their home heating, but which I feel is not well communicated or understood in national capitals. There is some space. People don't care so much about these things, and perhaps there is the space for pushing that through.
It's worth saying, because I think sometimes maybe in our bad communication between London and Brussels, this isn't well understood. In Brussels, the ETS is a really big deal, right? This is part of big political discourse in relation to, work that the Commission's doing, work that the Parliament's doing. The ETS is a big mechanism. In London, it's not. It is not talked about. That's not to say it's not important, but it's viewed as a relatively technical policy in a department that people don't often talk about. If I look back in the parliamentary records, I could maybe find you half a dozen conversations about it over the last 10 years, which are substantive in our UK Parliament. And, it's just a different way of discussing these issues. But I do think that it's interesting, and it goes to that sense of, how can we bring people with us? How can we inform people? But particularly in this sense, how can we ensure that, British politicians are not going to feel the wrath of the UK public if they decide to link their emissions trading system? I would say, if you find me a member of Parliament that has an operational understanding of the ETS, beyond those that have worked in and around the energy department, I will be very impressed. So if you find me people outside of the energy sector and the climate sector in the British public that also know what this is, I would be shocked.
Can I just echo that, from our perspective as well? When I was in Brussels, it was like the ETS, everyone was obsessed with the ETS. I don't think anyone's ever mentioned the ETS to me in a UK context in my current role.
I have a long list of questions remaining, but time is against us. Heather raises the hand, but Georg already abused his position at the front to catch. No, he's withdrawn. No, he did abuse the position at the front to catch my eye while they were talking and ask the first question. And more questions welcomed afterwards.
Yes, thanks, Ben. I have a rather economist's type of question on. If we are now talking about electricity being more freely traded, if that were the solution, would it actually be good for the UK if electricity is then potentially more often exported and prices go up? And while at the same time, the trade of energy-intensive products between Europe and the UK is still being somewhat blocked, not only by CBAM but also by tariffs. So is there a sense to be made that if we open up, then we should try to. There is kind of an element of that we have to open up the entirety of things, otherwise you will have distortions of electricity going to where it is used for something that cannot be traded while and that increasing distortion. Sorry for being a bit.
I think we might take a couple and then feel free to take which ones you're interested in. I have Heather.
Thanks. A slightly related question, Heather Graby from Bruegel, which is really about the politics of energy. I mean, as you've all been pointing out, the public mostly doesn't notice or care until there's a crisis. Either there's a risk the lights go out or prices go up massively. Now, we've had that crisis recently, and in fact, solutions were found quite quickly. We could, over the next term of this government in the UK and the Commission, have a number of other crises coming up for energy. One is sabotage. So the risk of, for example, offshore wind being attacked. This is already a concern in the Commission. I know they're thinking about civilian infrastructure protection and so on. Another could, of course, be other forms of attack which cause parts of the energy infrastructure to be under threat. And then there are also various market crises that can emerge. So what's the best way from the private sector perspective as well as the policy perspective to give the public, both the investors and also the consumers, a sense of direction, that the benefits of interdependence outweighing the vulnerabilities? Because there's bound to be a lot of talk about, oh, look how vulnerable this is, look at how easily electricity can be sold elsewhere, look at how it can actually force prices up, all the issues just been raised, but also the vulnerabilities of depending on an interconnected network. So how to make the most of the benefits of having more distributed production of electricity, plus more trade, ultimately providing more security. I can just imagine the same Brexiteer type arguments being made about this, of don't depend on other countries, don't sell to other countries, when actually, ultimately, that's better for security. How can you make that in a very coherent way? Because it seems to me that's something that needs to be in the public debate now, before crisis hits. Thank you.
Last one just in front of Heather, and then I'll hand over to
thank you. My name is Sanjeev Kumar. I'm the Head of Policy at the European Geothermal Energy Council. Fascinating conversation, and the theme is time. Michael Grubb started off with time. Hazel's been talking about time. And I think we need to be a bit more honest. We don't have the luxury of 5 years. I think we've got a window of 18 months before the whole world and other issues start to move around us. So in order to get to the nitty-gritty of a regulatory alignment around the emissions trading or any kind of market rules around electricity, there has to be a sexy, politically attractive deal that cooperates and builds the trust and allows things to fruition. So the idea we're kind of playing with kind of builds upon Heather's point that if we look through the lens of energy security, which is a common theme and will always be a front political issue, then decentralizing our energy system is super important. At the moment, that conversation is galvanized by electricity systems. If we were to look at cooperation around renewable heating and cooling, which by definition is decentralized, much more local, much more politically astute. Somebody mentioned a point about the ETS2. The only reason that's an issue is because it's going to hit people's energy bills, and there's going to be a lot of angry voters. And at the same time, the one thing, or the two things that are happening globally, the EU is about to agree conclusions on geothermal, the call for a geothermal strategy. The UK has had its first 3 big geothermal power plants and is looking at heat zoning in a very aggressive way. Is that an idea for a potential first collaboration to bring and build trust between the UK and the EU? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would hand over first to Carsten, and then the others, please take whichever you see best, and maybe keep to 2 minutes, and then we'll open the floor again for 3 more questions afterwards. Thanks.
Really like Heather's question. I think we've had a long history of putting central versus decentral approaches in conflict with each other. And I like to talk about local marketplace. So here in Brussels, what's the power price in Brussels? To which I respond, because there's a lot of solar right now, the price is low, and then I charge my battery, my heat storage, and anything else. I think that is something people can relate to. Obviously, this local marketplace is interconnected, luckily, with the overall national European system. Otherwise, it would be horribly expensive to kind of balance each local marketplace, because we don't have that type of storage that would allow for this. So I think we have to make the entire system communicable and accessible for consumers. such that people don't move into semi-autarky strategies, which I think is right now a big risk. Rich people run their own batteries, don't pay much for chargers anymore, and the remaining stuff is left with the people that are most vulnerable. So I think we really need to get access to understanding what the system is through local marketplaces, building on the US nodal pricing approach, well established, 3 European historical suppliers that can vent the software with it. But think through it from the consumer's perspective. That transition obviously has concerns for investors. What does it mean? Where do I stand? But I think if we go for CFD or other type of long-term contracts that are tendered through an agency, then they guarantee the price at your location. So any project is insulated from the local price risk on the investment side, and consumers are hedged by having access to this pool on the consumer side as well. So you can create direct stability whilst this transition is going on, and therefore help on this dimension as well. Where's the urgency for change? I think the urgency we see right now because of a system where we not only have renewables but increasing flexibility on the system. Luckily, we get batteries to the system. And what we do is notice in Germany, if there's a lot of sunshine in the south, then we start to charge the batteries in the north. And then we have to kind of spill sun in the south and kickstart a power station in the north. And likewise with wind, the other way around. We always charge the wrong batteries, or half the time the wrong batteries. Some other countries already put moratorium on battery connection to the system. So we will, in this system, only get batteries operated by TSOs. These are centralized systems, but they don't really help us on the distribution networks. Plus, we all know how tough it is to build European batteries, what are all the environmental elements to this. Why don't we use heat storage, product storage, all the other elements? We can't run them through the TSO centralized. We need local marketplaces if we want to use flexibility in the system. And I think there's various reasons right now to think of urgency to use these flexibility components, which we don't get with our centralized big pricing zones. And the final part on the politics, we've got a huge debate in Germany right now on power prices. And I think the helpful part is we finally move beyond the debate where power market reform is done by all the actors in the power system that try to kind of make a pie bigger so they can share the profits in there. And we can really look for solutions that are efficient and competitive, and I think make this quickly.
Something you want to add, Adam, quickly? 60 seconds.
Sure. So look, on the energy security thing, energy systems evolve, risk evolves. I'm not sure it changes much, not least because the UK and indeed most European countries have moved from a system where they've had very few power stations, which if any third party had decided to attack would have made that country incredibly vulnerable very, very quickly. The same thing happens now if you decide to snip a few undersea kind of high voltage cables. I think the vulnerabilities change over time. I'm not sure they fundamentally differ. I think actually the silver lining of the energy system we're moving to is the demand side, which we've never had before. So in the UK, particularly during the height of the energy crisis, our electricity system operator introduced this thing called the Demand Flexibility Scheme, which is now a standing scheme, and it's probably going to evolve into basically the framework for the new energy market, which is that there are millions of households taking part in a demand flexibility scheme, which allows them to turn down their energy usage, earn a bit of money at times of kind of peak demand and low supply. For me, that's a kind of model for what the energy system is likely to look like in probably sooner than we think, to be honest. Certainly in the UK, I would imagine the late 2020s is going to look like that. That's not very far away. Just on electricity trading, kind of, Georg, to your point, the UK is going to become a net exporter very quickly of electricity. That has not been the case. But by the time we're up to about 2027, 2028, I imagine it becomes a net exporter. As long as there is consistency of revenue, there's every reason for developers to continue building, and there's every way for interconnectors to continue that trade. I'm not sure at the moment that we see that as a net loss to the UK. I think generally that's seen in a positive light, but let's see how the discussion goes. Just finally on the point of a timing, because I think this is so key. I think it is absolutely right that we don't, in practice, we don't have loads of time to get some of this done. There is a moment of political opportunity, and for me, I think a lot rests on the first quarter. Well, we're expecting first quarter kind of summit between von der Leyen and Starmer. I think if the UK doesn't come with big items on the agenda, it's going to be very hard to make the progress that we need to make in relatively short order.
Thanks, Adam. I think we have time for one last question, which I will give to Ignacio. And potentially, if you take 30 seconds, Michael, 30 seconds, because Ignacio published this morning a piece on pretty much this topic from trade policy perspective. So to you, Ignacio.
Well, I would try to be very brief because it's two follow-up questions essentially to Adam. Now, first on the issue of the linkages, it seems to me to be such a no-brainer that I find it so difficult to understand that the UK has not really come forward with any clear ideas on that. Is it because you need to coordinate the position of different UK departments, environment and treasury? But I mean, what is your expectation about the UK coming with a clear position in favor of a linkage of the two ETSs in the short term? And then on the famous energy chapter of the TCA, which is supposed to expire in 2026 unless it is extended, I guess renegotiating an energy chapter will be extremely difficult. So there is a certain temptation to go for the piece of this resistance, which is to extend. Is there any idea about what could be done perhaps to complement the energy chapter with something else that could provide the extra security which is needed for investment? Is there any thoughts about what could be done on energy between now and 2026?
Great questions. On linkage, why has the UK government not come forward? The last UK government didn't come forward because they had some ideological baggage, and that was difficult to have that discussion. That is the only reason. This government, any sense of an ideological blocker to policies like that, it's gone. It's just not in discussions anymore, which is really positive. I think it's genuinely because there's a new government, they've hit the ground running, but they're taking some time, and particularly on climate neutrality and net zero, there's a big reevaluation of our carbon budgets, and they're trying to figure out how they meet them. And so that has included carbon pricing, which is, I think, one of the reasons why the UK government, amongst others, that the UK government hasn't necessarily come out as soon as they might have done. Yes, there's lots of cross-departmental government issues because technically it's the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero that owns it, but in practice, the Treasury has a large say on it, and because it's related to industry, the Department for Business and Trade gets involved, and now the Cabinet Office is leading on European affairs. So yes, there's usual Whitehall complexity. On the energy chapter, yes, to those that don't know, so it expires in 2026, and it is linked explicitly to the fisheries chapter of the TCA, precisely because the European Commission knew that the UK wanted something out of energy, so they linked a difficult topic to that one. I think what industry has been trying to tell the British government is don't just treat these relatively arbitrary deadlines as the moment when you have to approach a particular issue. So don't wait until the latter part of 2025 to discuss this, because it's going to be really difficult. Actually, I mean, I think there is a solution to electricity trading which is on the table, which actually works within the confines of how the TCA is already set up legally, which is this price coupling. There's some detail that needs to be fleshed out there, but on the face of it, I think it's a really feasible option. My encouragement to the UK government, certainly when we've been in these conversations, has been to say that there would be a good argument to move quicker on that, ideally as soon as possible, so that by the time you get to 2026, you don't end up with what at this point is the worst of all possible worlds. Is not only do you end up with the thing that already doesn't work, continuing that, but probably you're asked for something by the Commission in order just to keep the crap policy that you already don't like on the table. And that seems to be a pretty unsatisfactory kind of trade negotiation. So I would encourage the UK government to get ahead of that problem.
Very British and very honest. Thanks. Carsten, 1 minute. Hazel, 1 minute, and then we close. Otherwise, I'm in trouble.
On the linking, the part I'm really struggling to understand with, if UK, as a big country with strong governance processes, changes its carbon budgets, and therefore also the shorter term targets, in one way or the other, it will have trade flow implications on carbon allowances between continental Europe and Britain. And they are in a way that they motivate either one of the parties to get less ambitious, so as to sell more allowances to the other party. And so that's for me the main obstacle for linking, if we don't have an aligned target setting or ambition level setting. And that's why I feel it is a very political question, and we can't solve it technically at the linking side.
Although, just very quickly,
15 seconds.
Is worth saying. Only 25% of emissions are now covered. In fact, even less than that on the UK ETS. So I think in Brussels, often the ETS is still seen through the prism of it covers a lot of emissions in the economy. It's actually dwindling on the UK side. So I think there's absolutely alignment of targets is an issue, but I think that specific one of competitiveness probably would have been an issue 5 years ago. I see it as less salient now.
And just to echo that, it's definitely not the technical issues that we can't resolve. There are a number of people obsessed with ETS arrangements, trading arrangements, academics, industry people who can fix the technical parts. It is the, like you're suggesting, it's the politics part of it. And I see someone else ask that question as well. Isn't it all about politics? It's like people know how to fix this. We know what to do. You guys, everyone knows what to do, but it's just how to get on with it. And I think at the moment, something Heather said, one of your things you said about we're already doing this. It's like we're already interconnected. It's not like we're suggesting we're doing something different. It's like, and there's a bit of a comms piece on all of us to help people to understand that this is something that already exists. It's just about improving the efficiency of it to make it better for everybody and ultimately your pocket and security at the end of the day. And I'm not saying we scaremonger people into it. It's just being matter of fact about the fact that this already exists, but we can make it better. And I think the door is open for those UK-EU conversations, and we need to get right through that door before it closes again and start pushing the conversation. And that's on us, Adam.
Thank you very much. We didn't solve it, but I hope we made some progress on UK-EU relations with UCL. They will continue to work on this. I'm sure at Bruegel we will, and I'm sure many in this room, and I hope that in the next 12 months there can be progress made. Thank you very much, everybody online who joined, and those in the room. You have the special privilege that we now have a 1 hour lunch, so you can come with all the remaining questions to the panelists and others in the room. Thanks.